My husband took everything I had from me, but I found the courage to turn it around. I never thought my life could change so much in such a short time. I always believed that effort and dedication would be enough to guarantee happiness and stability, and for many years I lived that illusion. My routine was organized. I woke up early, made coffee, helped the kids get ready for school, kept the house tidy, and then rushed to take care of the day's tasks. Everything seemed under control. But, looking back, I realize I lived more for others than for myself. My sense of accomplishment was mixed with a constant exhaustion I never fully understood. Little by little, I noticed small frustrations I tried to ignore. Comments that belittled my choices, decisions made without my consent, the feeling that my voice didn't matter as much as it should. At first, I thought it was normal, part of marriage, of life as a couple, but there was something eroding my inner peace. I needed to find a balance between caring for my family and preserving who I was, but I didn't know how. It was like walking a narrow road, unaware that each step took me further away from what I truly wanted. From the outside, my life seemed perfect. An organized house, obedient children, a present husband. Inside, there was a growing sense of imprisonment I couldn't yet name. My name is Silvana, and the story I'm about to share happened about 7 years ago. At the time, I was 32, married to Ottavio for 10 years, and our children, Jonas and Livia, were 13 and 8, respectively. I worked part-time in a clothing store, which allowed me to balance my household routine with some financial independence. I've always prided myself on being dedicated, on keeping my family together, and on ensuring everyone's comfort and safety. I thought my life was balanced. I could meet the demands of Ottavio and the children, and still focus on my own little pleasures, like meeting friends and reading, occasionally. However, what seemed like balance gradually revealed itself to be a web of manipulation and control, carefully constructed by my husband. He always had a charming manner, a persuasive way of speaking that made me doubt my own perceptions. At first, I thought it was my oversensitivity or accumulated fatigue, but over time I realized there was a clear pattern. My decisions were never truly my own, and my efforts were constantly reinterpreted as insufficient or misdirected. Everything began to change subtly, with small demands disguised as care. Ottavio always claimed that everything he did was for the good of the family, but his rules were rigid and inflexible. The house had precise schedules, detailed chores, and whenever I tried to suggest something different, he would show irritation or disapproval. At first, I accepted it as normal, thinking that perhaps it was my laid-back attitude that didn't mesh with his discipline. But gradually, this rigidity began to suffocate me. Even my small achievements were minimized, as if my effort were worthless. No matter how hard I tried, the feeling of always falling short remained. I began to feel a silent sadness, a weight on my chest that I couldn't share even with friends, for fear of appearing ungrateful or incapable of handling my family responsibilities. What I didn't realize at that moment was that I was experiencing a dynamic of emotional control that was shaping my identity in a subtle but intense way, and that every day was taking me further away from the woman I could be. Jonas, our oldest son, began to replicate his father's behavior. He observed everything carefully and, little by little, incorporated Ottavio's authority in small, everyday situations. The way he criticized my ways of organizing the house or dealing with my siblings was disturbing. Livia, on the other hand, was more sensitive and inquisitive, but she was afraid to disobey her father, even when her wishes were simple and innocent. I found myself torn. I wanted to protect my children, but I also wanted them to grow up free, capable of making their own choices. The tension within the home was growing, but at that moment, I didn't know how to act. With each passing day, I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a controlling husband, but with a family system that reproduced and reinforced that power dynamic. I felt, for the first time, that my dedication wasn't enough, that there was something fundamental I needed to reclaim, my own voice. However, admitting this to myself was terrifying, and as much as I felt the discomfort, I continued to keep up appearances, believing that everything was under control. The first spark of insight came from Paula, my longtime friend. She had always admired me for being so dedicated, but she began warning me about signs I didn't want to see. Silvana, have you realized that your choices aren't yours? That you live to please Ottavio and everyone but yourself? At first, her words sounded harsh and even offensive. I didn't want to believe that my marriage and my dedication to my family could be detrimental to me. But little by little, I realized there was truth in what she was saying. The feeling of constant exhaustion, the silent discouragement, the difficulty in making simple decisions without consulting my husband. It all began to make sense. Paula became my rock, someone who helped me see the manipulation without feeling guilty. As much as the pain and frustration grew, there was a glimmer of hope. Perhaps it was possible to regain the autonomy and self-esteem I had neglected for so long. I didn't know how yet, but at that moment I realized that I wasn't alone and that my life could start to change, even if slowly and uncertainly. Over time, I began to realize that Ottavio was observing and evaluating my every move, and any mistake or decision that deviated from his rules resulted in silent or direct criticism, often involving Jonas as a reinforcement of his authority. My self-esteem began to plummet, and I felt trapped in a suffocating routine that was slowly consuming me. Even simple moments of leisure or rest were interrupted by observations about how I was taking care of the house, my family, or myself. What should have been cared for became surveillance, and I felt constantly indebted. The fear of displeasing and the feeling of inadequacy began to dominate my daily life. My conversations with Paula became increasingly frequent and urgent, and her words insisted on reminding me that I didn't have to live this way. I began to reflect on my own needs, desires, and wants, and realized that I had been neglecting the woman within me for years. It was a painful process, because each mental breakthrough was accompanied by reminders of what I had lost by submitting to a standard that didn't belong to me. Livia began to question her father more openly, something I secretly admired but also deeply worried me about. She was young, still, developing, and the fear of retaliation or disapproval was constant. Ottavio tolerated no challenge. Any sign of independence was interpreted as disrespect. I saw my daughter struggle internally, torn between her love for her father and her desire for freedom, and this awakened in me a mixture of compassion and urgency. I needed to act not only for myself, but for her as well. The tension at home grew daily, and moments of harmony became increasingly rare. Jonas, for his part, absorbed his father's behaviors naturally, reinforcing his sense of authority and making my attempts to set boundaries even more difficult. I felt lost in a system that brooked no mistakes and that my voice was lost. The daily struggle was no longer just about household chores or family organization. It became about my own identity and the ability to protect my children without completely nullifying myself. The situation reached its critical point on an ordinary morning. Ottavio harshly criticized the way I had planned the week, questioned my competence, and then directed the same pressure at Jonas, as if I were failing to teach my own son to follow rules. I felt a crushing weight on my chest, a mixture of anger, sadness, and frustration that made me realize I could no longer ignore what was happening. The feeling of imprisonment became unbearable. I needed concrete changes. It was at that moment that I decided to seek support outside the home. I called Paula, and for the first time, confessed that I was afraid, not only of what was happening, but also of what could happen if I remained passive. Hearing words of encouragement, feeling empathy, and knowing that someone believed in me awakened a dormant strength. The first real spark of courage, I had to face what seemed insurmountable. I began to observe my own behavior more closely, identifying patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. Every veiled criticism, every excessive demand, every form of psychological manipulation became clear. Understanding that I was being controlled didn't bring immediate relief. It brought anger, fear, and a profound sense of injustice. But it also brought clarity. If I wanted to change my life, I could no longer depend on Ottavio's approval or wait for Jonas or Livia to resolve the situation for me. I needed to act, strategically but firmly. I began seeking small ways to regain autonomy, simple decisions, moments of silence to reflect, small daily victories that strengthened my confidence. Each step was accompanied by fear, but also by a growing sense of power over my own life. Gradually, I realized that my strength had been there all along, hidden beneath years of submission and people-pleasing habits. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon, but it changed my perspective forever. Ottavio began aggressively questioning my decisions about Livia's education, insinuating that I was failing as a mother and wife. For a moment, I felt like shrinking and disappearing, giving in to the oppressive voice that told me I wasn't capable. But something inside me rebelled. For the first time, I felt I couldn't keep quiet. I took a deep breath, sat at the table, and with a trembling voice, I began to express my insights, explaining how his actions affected us and how it felt to see my children under constant pressure. The feeling of vulnerability was intense, but also liberating. It was the first time in years that I allowed myself to be heard, unapologetically, without minimizing my needs. As frightening as it was to face Ottavio's critical gaze, I felt I could no longer live in the shadow of someone who distorted care into control. Courage was born from exhaustion, indignation, and the need to protect not only myself, but also my children, who were beginning to doubt their own space and freedom within the home. Jonas reacted immediately, assuming the role of his father's defender. He tried to intimidate me, repeating the words and gestures he'd learned from Ottavio. For a few minutes, I felt a chill run through my body, a mixture of fear and frustration. But instead of backing down, I realized this was an opportunity to show my children that it was possible to question, challenge, and still maintain dignity. I told them how I felt, without accusing or creating divisions, simply sharing the truth directly. Surprisingly, Livia approached me, holding my hand as if to say, "You are not alone." In that simple gesture, I realized the change wasn't just about me, but about the entire family dynamic. That moment became the catalyst for transforming years of submission into a process of affirmation and recovery of identity. For the first time, I felt my voice carried weight, that my decisions mattered, and that I could fight for my place without feeling guilty. In the days that followed, I began to establish clear boundaries, small barriers that signaled that my life would no longer be defined by Ottavio's demands. It was painful and challenging. He tried to regain control, criticizing my choices, questioning my actions, and placing obstacles. Each confrontation was a silent but necessary battle. I needed to prove to myself that I was no longer at the mercy of his judgment. I began to organize myself for moments of financial and emotional independence, making decisions about my work, my schedule, and my leisure time without consulting anyone. Each victory, no matter how small, became a foundation for rebuilding my confidence, the feeling of power over my own life was intense and liberating, but it also required constant vigilance. Any retreat could mean returning to old patterns of submission. It was like walking a tightrope, learning to trust myself amidst the fear of making mistakes. During this period, Nelson, our neighbor, became a discreet but important presence. He observed the family dynamics from the outside and offered me advice without judgment, simply listening and suggesting ways to preserve my emotional security. His words were a constant reminder that the outside world didn't define me as weak and that it was possible to seek help and support. I began to open up to him about my deepest fears, about the feeling of imprisonment I'd been experiencing for years. Each conversation was a dose of courage that prepared me to face Ottavio with greater clarity and determination. External confidence added to the internal strength I was already beginning to recognize. It was as if each small gesture, each piece of advice, and each word of support solidified the certainty that I wasn't alone and that I could finally make decisions about my own life. The decisive moment culminated in a definitive conversation with Ottavio. I was prepared emotionally and strategically. I knew what I wanted to express, I knew my limits, and I had practiced ways to maintain my firm stance without giving in to fear or manipulation. He tried to maintain control with charm and intimidation, but I didn't back down. I explained that my decisions now included my own voice, my autonomy, and my responsibility for my happiness. It was painful to confront someone who had for so long been an undisputed authority, but the feeling of finally asserting my existence was indescribable. Even though there was uncertainty about the consequences, I realized that this was the necessary breaking point to transform my life. For the first time, I felt the power of courage, clarity, and determination. The feeling of liberation didn't come immediately, but it was undoubtedly the starting point of a new phase, a path of construction, learning, and personal reconquest that would forever change the relationship I had with myself and my family. After that decisive conversation, life began to reorganize itself differently. There was still tension, criticism, and resistance from Ottavio and Jonas, but I no longer felt paralyzed. I began implementing small changes in my daily life, making independent decisions, setting clear boundaries, and creating spaces for myself. The feeling of rediscovery was intense. Small moments of freedom, like organizing the house my way, choosing what to cook, planning activities with Livia without interference, became symbols of autonomy. Each achievement, no matter how small, reinforced my confidence and strengthened my self-esteem. I began to realize that I no longer needed to ask for permission to exist, and that caring for my happiness was a legitimate, not selfish act. The process was gradual, often painful, but each step brought me closer to who I truly wanted to be. It was impressive to feel that my life, which previously seemed controlled and limited, could be rebuilt through conscious, and assertive choices. With Paula's support, I learned to deal with the guilt I felt for prioritizing my own needs. She constantly reminded me that taking care of myself wasn't about neglecting my family, but rather ensuring I had the strength to be present in a healthy way. Little by little, I began to establish new routines, balancing childcare, work, and self-care. My confidence in my decisions grew with each passing day. I felt my previously suppressed voice begin to resonate inside and outside the home. Livia also grew stronger. Encouraged by my example, she began to express her desires and opinions with more confidence, realizing that her choices were valid. Jonas still followed his father's authority, but I began to notice small cracks in the rigidity he imitated, as if my firm stance was awakening the awareness that life could be different from what he believed. For me, overcoming obstacles also involved understanding that I didn't need to control everything to feel secure. I learned to accept imperfections, both my own and those of those around me, and to deal with conflict without giving in to submission. Each challenging situation became a training ground for emotional resilience, discussing decisions, facing criticism, and maintaining my composure, without crumbling internally. The feeling of power over my own life grew with each experience, solidifying the confidence that I could, in fact, choose my path without fear. The process was slow, but real. Rebuilding self-esteem, establishing boundaries, and rediscovering emotional balance required daily practice, constant courage, and patience with myself. I began to realize that my strength lay not only in my reaction to Ottavio, but in my ability to remain true to myself, regardless of the circumstances. At the same time, I began investing in myself in ways that previously seemed superfluous or even selfish. I resumed courses I'd abandoned, made friends outside my family circle, and began allowing myself moments of leisure and reflection. Each choice was a reminder that my life belonged to me, and that I no longer needed to live under the shadow of other people's rules. This reconstruction didn't erase the years of submission, but it gave me tools to deal with them in a healthy way. I realized that emotional freedom came from the combination of self-knowledge, courage, and the support of people who truly cared. Nelson remained a reference point, someone who reminded me that there was no shame in seeking help, and that real change required not only inner strength but also openness to seeing the world differently. One of the most significant lessons was realizing that my relationship with Ottavio would change, but it didn't have to be based on constant confrontation. By establishing clear boundaries, protecting my autonomy, and demonstrating that my choices were legitimate, the family dynamic began to balance. There were still conflicts, yes, but the tension stopped being paralyzing and became manageable. I could be a mother, wife, and woman autonomously without giving up my essence. Each victory, each moment my voice was heard, cemented the feeling that overcoming wasn't about eliminating all obstacles, but about learning to walk in spite of them. I realized that my freedom didn't have to be absolute right away. All it took was awareness and control over my decisions, even small ones, to feel like I was finally living the life that belonged to me. Looking back today, I realize how much that phase of my life shaped me. Every tear, every fear, every moment I felt like I couldn't move forward helped strengthen the woman I am today. I learned that it's not about erasing the past or forgetting challenges, but about recognizing that we are capable of facing difficult situations and transforming them into learning experiences. My relationship with Ottavio changed. We didn't eliminate our differences, but I learned to stand firm, preserving my autonomy and dignity. Jonas, still heavily influenced by his father, gradually began to realize that there are different ways to approach life. Livia blossomed into her own independence, and I'm proud to have been part of that development. The feeling of emotional freedom is real, even if it's not always complete. I discovered that overcoming adversity isn't an endpoint, but an ongoing process of reaffirmation and conscious choice. As I share my experience with others, I realize that many identify with situations of manipulation and control, disguised as care or concern. What I've learned is that recognizing patterns of oppression is the first step to reclaiming one's life. Every choice I make now is based on the awareness that I deserve respect, autonomy, and happiness. I can say with certainty that the strength to overcome those years of submission was within me all along, hidden beneath habits of pleasing and obeying. I discovered that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting despite fear. It's finding energy even when everything seems to indicate that giving up would be easier. This realization transformed my relationship with myself and others, allowing me to build a more balanced, healthy, and respectful home without having to erase the past, but learning from it. Today, I feel more whole, more authentic, and more capable of facing any challenge. Experience has taught me that freedom and autonomy are achievements that require courage, consistency, and patience. I still deal with moments of doubt or tension, but now I know how to maintain my voice and my decisions intact, even in the face of external pressure. My relationship with my children has strengthened. Livia has become confident and self-assured, and Jonas, despite following his father's influence, has begun to realize the importance of respect and individual autonomy. I have rediscovered myself, understanding that I don't need to please or obey to be valued. I discovered that true strength lies not in controlling or dominating, but in living in alignment with who we truly are, and that this transforms not only our lives, but also the lives of those around us. Overcoming obstacles is an ongoing journey, but I'm proud of every step I've taken so far. I've learned that it's possible to break cycles of control and manipulation, reclaim my voice, and build a life based on conscious choices. Today, I can confidently say that I'm the protagonist of my own story. My voice carries weight, my desires have value, and my life is my own. Even though not all conflicts have disappeared, the difference is that I now have clarity, autonomy, and the courage to face any challenge. Sharing my experience with you is a way to inspire those who feel trapped or undervalued, showing that it's possible to rise up and regain control of your life. Learning to put yourself first, without guilt or fear, is the greatest victory I've ever achieved. Every day, I reaffirm my right to exist fully and live according to my principles, desires, and dreams. This is my story of overcoming obstacles, struggle, and above all, freedom.